Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. And today I'm going to talk about 3 bad ways to combat Jesus mythicism. So mythicism is the view that Jesus never existed. He was a fictional character, a mythic character, and that Christianity was not based in any way on an actual Jesus of Nazareth who walked the earth. Now, I will say that Jesus mythicism is not uncommon among certain atheist communities online, but it's practically non-existent among scholars. So if you read Bart Ehrman's book, so Bart Ehrman is an agnostic New Testament scholar. He used to be Christian. He left the faith. He's one of the world's leading experts on New Testament documents. So even as an agnostic, Ehrman tells us on page 4 of his 2012 book, Did Jesus Exist?, that it is the opinion of virtually every expert on the planet that Jesus did exist. So there are only a handful, maybe I probably count them on one hand, of people with relevant PhDs who believe that Jesus never existed. And to my knowledge, none of them teach at major universities or seminaries or anything like that. But you've probably come across people online who said that Jesus didn't exist, they're mythicists, said that the story of Jesus was copied from pagan mythology. So you may have come across mythicism and attempted to engage it. On previous episodes of the podcast, I've done rebuttals to Zeitgeist, for example, which is the classic documentary that has that whole Jesus was a ripoff of pagan gods like Horus and Mithra. So if you want my complete takedown of those kinds of arguments, definitely check out that video. But what I want to talk about today are the bad arguments, because we should always combat error with the best arguments, or at least good arguments. But it is a mistake if we combat it with bad arguments, because sometimes people can show, especially if you think it's a good argument, it could shake somebody's faith. If they don't realize they're actually using a weak argument, it can lead people into error. It can make the other side think, oh, these people, they got no good arguments to their position, when actually we most certainly do. So let's jump right into that then and talk about these 3 different arguments that I hear when Christians attempt to defend that Jesus existed. So, number 1, I've heard this one a lot, is the claim that there is more historical evidence for the existence of Jesus of Nazareth than there is for Julius Caesar. Right off the bat, I'm skeptical of a claim like that, because John Meyer, who is a moderate scholar, many things I disagree with him on, but he wrote an excellent 4-volume series called Jesus, a Marginal Jew. And that was a great description for who Jesus was. When Jesus was crucified, he was a marginal Jew. He was the leader of a tiny sect of people, 12 when he was crucified, well, 11. And he was the leader of that group, and they were a tiny marginalized group within Judaism in a backwater province of the Roman Empire, very far away from Rome, from the center of the empire. Christianity didn't rise to prominence within Rome for many decades after Jesus' life. For a while, Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism and part of a Jewish disagreement. So, for example, the Roman writer Suetonius tells us that Jews in Rome were expelled by Emperor Claudius because of an instigator named Chrestus. We don't know exactly who that refers to. That could be, or it could just be a regular, Chrestus was a common name, so it could just be a reference to a Jew or someone named Chrestus leading a mob, and the Jews were arguing and rioting amongst each other. Or Chrestus could be a reference to Christ or Christus, that Jews and Christians were fighting with each other in Rome, and then the emperor just expelled all of them from the city. All the Jews and Christians were considered Jews. Many Christians thought of themselves as Jews. They still went and worshipped at the synagogue, for example, even though on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, they gathered together to receive the Eucharist. But many of them were still attending synagogues and temples until they were kicked out from there. So I'm just skeptical that you have Julius Caesar, the emperor, Roman emperor, that somehow we would have more evidence for Jesus, even though Jesus was a much more marginal figure in his lifetime than Caesar was. So I think this is just not a good comparison. We don't need to compare Jesus to Julius Caesar because we believe in many other individuals who existed in the time of Jesus who were not leaders of the entire empire. You don't need to compare that. We believe John the Baptist, even many atheists who deny Jesus existed, believe John the Baptist existed. Josephus writes about him. We'll talk about Josephus in a bit. Rabbi Gamaliel, Rabbi Hillel, Shammai. And that's just in the time of Jesus himself. We can look at other historical episodes. William Wallace, who is portrayed in the movie Braveheart, the Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace. The first written biography really we have of Wallace was 150 years later, written by a blind minstrel. I think his name was like Blind Harry, maybe, and like a brief mention in the Scotichronicon. But nobody seriously doubts that William Wallace existed. There's doubts about aspects of his life. With Jesus, a much stricter test is put over, or a stricter framework, if you will. So just putting it out there saying, well, you should believe Jesus existed because we have more evidence for Jesus than for Julius Caesar. That is just not a good argument, and frankly, it's just not true. I'll link in the description here to an answer on Quora. Not all these answers are great at Quora.com, but I trust this one because it comes from Tim O'Neill. Tim O'Neill, it's spelled here with 2 L's at the end. I have a friend, Tim O'Neill, who it's 1 L at the end. But so the point that this O'Neill is making, he's an atheist who rebuts and argues against Jesus mythicism. He's saying that it's equally wrong to say there is the same amount of evidence for Julius Caesar as for Jesus. We have more evidence for Caesar. We have coins that were inscripted, coins minted during the time of his reign, inscriptions dedicated to him. We don't have that for Jesus. We have his own autobiography. We have the actual writings of Julius Caesar himself. We don't have that for Jesus. Now, we still have very good sources for Jesus. You just don't need to compare that to Julius Caesar because you're raising the bar high. We would expect to have a lot of sources for the emperor of Rome, and we wouldn't expect to have as many for a rabbi that was leading a marginal group of Jews that only rose to prominence within the Roman Empire decades after his crucifixion, for the faith to be able to spread via churches and the proclamation of the gospel. The point is that O'Neill, in his article here, his answer, he traces this claim back to F.F. Bruce in 1960. F.F. Bruce is a conservative evangelical scholar, very good biblical scholar. And in there, Bruce was comparing the manuscript evidence for Julius Caesar versus the manuscript evidence for Jesus. And here I might say, yeah, we have better manuscript evidence for Jesus in that we have more copies of works that describe Jesus in ancient manuscripts than we do for Caesar. I did a whole episode about this on the podcast as well, called How the Bible Beats Every Ancient Book. You'll definitely want to go and definitely go check that out. This is what Bruce says. For Caesar's Gallic War, there are several extant manuscripts, but only 9 or 10 are good. And the oldest is some 900 years later than Caesar's day. Whereas we have thousands of New Testament manuscripts, dozens within the first few centuries of Jesus' life. We don't have to wait 900 years to get the first copy of a gospel, for example. So then O'Neill goes on to say, Bruce here is making an argument for the textual integrity of the New Testament books. In the hands of later Christian apologists, most notoriously Josh McDowell, this argument became muddled into something to do with not the integrity of the text, but the historical reliability of the contents and the events described, which makes no sense at all. This in turn got garbled still further by repetition until it somehow turned into there is more evidence for Jesus' existence than there is for Julius Caesar's, which is complete garbage. By using stupid, garbled arguments like this, ignorant fundamentalist Christians play directly into the hands of the Jesus never existed anti-theist fringe, who are almost as incompetent and ignorant of history, but not so much so that they can't see this claim about Jesus and Caesar is total crap. End quote. So we can make a lot of other comparisons to show we have better evidence for Jesus than other well-attested historical figures. We just don't have to choose as grand a figure as somebody like Julius Caesar, for example. Here's the next one. Some people say, well, of course we know Jesus existed because Pontius Pilate wrote a letter to Emperor Tiberius talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. I've heard people actually mention this to me, saying, why don't you talk about the letter Pontius Pilate wrote to Emperor Tiberius? And I never understood where they got this idea because we don't have any of Pontius Pilate's writings. None. We don't have any of Pilate's writings whatsoever. We had nothing we really had nothing in a Roman history, a non-Jewish Roman history, talking about Pilate. We have nothing until Tacitus, writing the Annals of Rome in the 2nd century AD, writing about how the crucifixion of Christ, he wrote about Christus being crucified under the procurator Pontius Pilate. Now, we did discover in the 1960s a headstone with an inscription related to Pilate. We haven't found anything like a report. We have no reports or any writings from Pontius Pilate. So in my investigation, I found that I think this claim comes from the church fathers, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, claiming that Pilate had written a report of this. They're telling people there is a report of the crucifixion. Go and check it in the archives. It may be possible. But I just don't think it's going to be very persuasive to atheistic critics because we have found no such report at all. So I just don't think they're going to take the church fathers' word on that. And definitely don't try to share with them the apocryphal letter itself. This has been dated to the Renaissance period. And it basically starts out, upon Jesus Christ, this is the purported letter from Pilate, but it's a Renaissance forgery. Upon Jesus Christ, whose case I had dearly set forth to thee in my last, at length, by the will of the people, a bitter punishment has been inflicted, myself being in a sort of unwilling and rather afraid. I did not, according to my strength, resist that innocent blood, free from the whole charge brought against it, but unjustly, through the malignity of men, should be sold and suffer, yet as the scriptures signify, to their own destruction, farewell. I wouldn't expect Pontius Pilate to speak of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, as the scriptures. But so don't cite this. It's where it comes from. It probably comes from a Latin text. I think has been dated to the year 16th century, like 1571. Though there's other things called the Acts of Pilate that go back more in a more apocryphal way in church history. But this isn't one of them. There are other kinds of forgeries at this time in church history, 15th, 16th century. Another famous one from the Renaissance period. This is from Italy in the 15th century. The Letter of Lentulus. It claims to be from a Roman official and claims to be a description of what Jesus looked like. He is a man of medium size. He has a venerable aspect. His hair is the color of a ripe hazelnut, straight down to the ears, but below the ears wavy and curled with bluish and bright reflection flowing over his shoulders, parted in two at the top of his head. Mouth and nose are faultless. His brow is smooth and very cheerful. It's an imaginative description. And there are others that go back in church history well among certain fathers, Eastern traditions. So be wary of this stuff. Put on your thinking caps. If something, look for the evidence. Look for the evidence behind it. Not just I want it to be true, but is there good evidence behind it showing that it is true? So don't make the comparison to Julius Caesar. We have just as good evidence for Jesus as many other minor figures in ancient history and other figures in history that were not recorded nearly as well. Don't bring up the Pontius Pilate letter because we don't have the actual letter itself. There are forgeries of it. I don't think many atheists will be impressed by the church fathers referencing a report. Finally, don't rely solely on Josephus. Don't say, well, look, Josephus said Jesus existed. You can make that argument. I have made that argument about the Jewish historian Josephus referencing Jesus, but you got to know the whole picture involved. First, you need to know that parts of Josephus's testimony, he writes about Jesus in two places, Book 18 and Book 20 of the Antiquities of the Jews. Book 20 is, I think, the stronger reference because it's a very brief reference about James being martyred when there was not a Roman procurator. He was martyred by the Sanhedrin. It says he was executed by the Sanhedrin, I should say. We would interpret his martyrdom. He's executed by the Sanhedrin. And it says this James was the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That's a very simple thing. I think there's good evidence that that's authentic. The longer one is the Testimonium Flavianum. I might do a whole episode on the non-Christian references to Jesus maybe at some point, but I'll just know parts of this are interpolated. I'll read it. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Right off the bat, when I said interpolation, I meant that a later Christian author added things he felt Josephus left out, like he was the Christ. He was restored to life on the third day. Josephus never converted or became Christian. I read one Catholic essay claiming he did, but there weren't very good arguments for that. So if you just put Josephus out there and you don't know parts of it are forged, you might have egg on your face if you don't know that. Now, you can be prepared. Like I would say, you're right. Some of this is forged, but I don't think all of it is. I think there's good evidence for that because there's other things in here. When you read this paragraph, it sounds like there's two different voices, a really Christian voice and a Jewish voice, and they're in conflict, which would show the forgeries added to something Josephus originally wrote. That he originally wrote, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. Now, it's interesting. Christians don't call Jesus a man. That's why the interpolator, the forger, wrote, if indeed one ought to call him a man. It's like, if he was just writing straight out a forgery, just skip that part. Just say, at this time there lived Jesus. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, or startling is another word, like it's not necessarily a positive thing. He won over many Jews, many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. That's interpolated. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. I think that's genuine. And I've also gone through and looked at the passages here and done a word search of the language, and it matches other things that Josephus writes. So when you look at the rest of the Antiquities, it's very similar to his language, whereas the forgers is not. And then the whole thing, the third day, prophets of God, that's forged, no doubt. But the last part, and the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Christians did not refer to themselves as a tribe. They called themselves the Way, the Church, but they didn't consider themselves just another tribe in Judaism. They weren't one of the 12 tribes. They were unique. They were the Jews who were following the Messiah. This sounds more like an outsider's view on Christians as just being another sect of Judaism following a failed Messiah, or being the remnants of a failed Messiah, but they did not give up on him, unlike other people whose Messiahs that they follow, like Theudas, the Egyptian, these other Messiah claimants at the time of Jesus or shortly thereafter, their followers gave up on them after they were exiled or killed. So yeah, I think it's fine to talk about Josephus's reference to Jesus, but just know the arguments against it and be able to answer them. So I think I'm giving you guys some bad arguments you shouldn't use. What are the good arguments? I would say first, the fact that this is the consensus of scholars, that the burden of proof is on a mythicist to show why the consensus of religious and non-religious scholars is wrong. They have the burden of proof, not us. Number two, one argument I like that I haven't seen pursued a lot in the literature, maybe I'll pursue it, is an argument from silence. The first people to seriously argue that Jesus did not exist at all, we don't see that until like the 17th or 18th centuries. If the mythicist theory says the first Christians believed Jesus was like a cosmic being, and then later Christians allegorized that and then mistakenly believed that Jesus actually had earthly existence. The first Christians didn't. But if that's true, then why didn't the disciples of the first Christians, those mythicists, why didn't they fight the heretical historicists later in church history? Why didn't they go and do that? We would expect then the people who believe Jesus existed were heretics to the mythicists. The mythicists would be heretics to the historicists who believe there was a real Jesus. We don't see any record of any conflict between them, which makes it the case that even though there were heretics in the early church, the Docetists believed Jesus existed, but he didn't have a human body. They all agreed that there was a Jesus. Finally, I would say that Paul is our early witness. Galatians chapter 1 is clear. He knew Peter, he knew the apostles, he knew James, the brother of the Lord. So if Jesus never existed, who is this brother, this relative? Could be cousin, kin, stepbrother. If Jesus didn't exist, even mythicists will say this is a big argument against their position, that Paul speaks about Jesus having having the Eucharist at dining or dinner with others. He's recounting the Last Supper tradition he's received. Talks about him being born of a woman, born under the law. I think that Paul is one of our best arguments against the mythicist view because he's so early. And then you could talk about the historical reliability of the Gospels themselves and how the Gospels don't seem like allegories that are meant to look like history but have a secret mythicist message behind them. I talk about that a lot in my debate with Richard Carrier several years ago. Also check out my book, Counterfeit Christ. I talk a lot about mythicism in that book. So I hope this is helpful for you all. I'll leave links to the description, links to resources I talked about in the description here below. Thank you guys, and I just hope you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.